This session we will cover anti-oppressive practice and decolonising supervision. I'm going to give you a brief summary of some of the research and some of the good practice guidance that's emerged from some of the training bodies and some of the university research departments. Before I do, I was just going to talk a bit about my experience of this area of work. I mean, I moved into clinical psychology from being a youth worker for 15 years, and the culture of the workplace as a youth worker was very different. Working in youth centres and youth work office, it was a very actively anti-discriminatory workplace that was very politicised. There was a lot of campaigns. It was anti-imperialist. It would take community activism in terms of responding to cuts, and I can remember youth work around Section 28 when that was brought in, but just generally in a youth work environment you'd be constantly managing the tone in the place and challenging young people who reproduced kind of racist or other kinds of prejudicial communication, and would be supporting colleagues with that. It was seen as part of a social empowerment role. When I moved into the psychological professions, it didn't seem so present in the workplace, and I remember asking some supervisors about this, and they were saying, oh well, it's there, it's in the codes of conduct, and it is, but it's been really valuable, I think, the last 3 to 4 years to see real reflections on that within clinical psychology, and the psychological professions helped, not least by trainees raising questions, expressing some concerns, doing research. And some of the research I'm going to quote now was done by trainees. I remember being part of the lectures and those kind of discussions, and we're all learning from these experiences. So an invitation to think about the culture of your workplace. And you might know the work of Sana Ahsan. She had a piece that came out in The Psychologist that referred to EDI as endless distraction and inaction, and what her experience is really valuable for us all to think about is what are the barriers to doing this work, and how can we do it kind of meaningfully and for it to be sustained. But I wanted to focus on the other side of her work that's really about offering comfort in our efforts to decolonise distress and supervision. So this is one of Sana's poems. So have a listen to that, and then just take a few minutes to reflect on what decolonising means for you. So I'm going to go through some of the research guidance on anti-oppressive practice. This is a limited but growing evidence base that's really flourished in the last few years. We're getting some more granular detail about how these processes unfold. And the changes, have been driven by trainees, but a small number of committed scholar activists, and I'll quote some of them, and also the role of international activists, after Black Lives Matter, that's really pushed the psychological professions into really thinking strategically about this agenda, and doing some research and doing some work on getting good practice going. Thinking more broadly, I think in terms of the literature, there's a significant influence of critical race theory. Now that's had some press the last couple of years, but goes back to research within jurisprudence and the scholarship of Crenshaw and colleagues. And I'll just go through some of the assumptions within critical race theory. First of all, that race lacks any genetic or scientific basis, and was largely, drawn on in the phony pseudoscience of eugenics and white supremacy in the early years of psychology. The next is that race is a social construction. However, we need to see race in order to address anti-racism. And there's racism can only be undone by foregoing colour blindness. So speaking as a white male, colour blindness is going to be a real challenge because of my dominant social position from being white, and so that needs a lot of thought and listening on my part. Alongside that, racism is endemic, invisibilised and structural. So it's built into systems and processes, and we reproduce it because we're not always aware of it. So we have to take a commitment in terms of reflexivity and noticing how we're all drawn into a range of oppressive ways of thinking. The next is that within the culture of white supremacy, part of its power is maintained by this systematic avoidance of discussions, education, reflections on talking about race. Without those opportunities, then it can leave practitioners feeling discomforted, shamed and self-blaming when finding challenges in this area of practice. Research has also shown that white people often have reduced resilience and stamina for discussions of race. This is something that's referred to as white fragility, and alongside that comes this discomfort and fear in discussing race, as we've said. The problem being that this can generate paralysis on the part of supervisors, or leads to the sort of centering of white feelings in the face of this discomfort. So there needs to be acceptance that race discussion can generate a lot of discomfort, but what can we do to ensure that supervisors, this doesn't block our capacity to think and support? And so there's an invitation in this good practice guidance that's emerging about supervisors, when they come across their own guilt or discomfort, to view it with kindness. And alongside that kindness, a sense of responsibility to learn and develop and be accountable for our learning as anti-oppressive supervisors. But what the research shows is that trainees, when they report discriminatory practice, it's often overlooked, dismissed or pathologised. And there's been some further work more recently in terms of the way that racism is often overlooked, that supervisors might not consider external drivers of racism, systems and institutions, and there might be an avoidance of exploring racialized experience, both of trainees and also clients. So as white supervisors, we need to accept that trainees from minoritized and racialized communities may have distinct placement experience, and they're likely to experience multiple microaggressions and racial incidents at work. So in terms of supervisor responsibilities, key one is around contracting. How in contracting can we generate what's sometimes called brave spaces, safe enough spaces in supervisory discussion of racism and other microaggressions at work? And there's, draw your attention to the reference there about brave spaces for thinking about that one. So what happens in practice? I'm just going to leave some quotes over the next few pages that have come direct from trainees in terms of their experience. I want to pause at this point to continue reading. I'm going to move on to the next slide. Some of these quotes have been kind of anonymised and details changed in discussion with the person sharing them. Pause and spend a bit longer reading those. And again, if you want to continue reading those, you might want to pause before I move on to the next slide. So what does good practice look like? This is something that's evolving all the time. We need to be constantly monitoring, getting feedback and doing CPD. Some really good CPD available from the digital resources produced by colleagues at the Leeds Doctoral program, and you can click on their link for some anti-racism training. At Surrey we also offer a 3-day training, so if you contact the placements coordinator, she can put you down for the next specialist round of training. But here's some summary of the good practice. So that the supervisor is responsible for putting racism on the agenda, and that's important for white dyads as well. As part of the negotiations around the contract, agreeing procedures for trainees bringing microaggressions to supervision and how discomfort will be managed, building that in early on. Acknowledge that the trainee may not feel comfortable discussing racism with you and may have other sources of support. And then there's a quote there from Dr. Tansy Warillo, who produced the guidance at Leeds, and Tansy pointed out that racialized psychologists would likely have been enduring conversations about race throughout life and developed their own methods of navigating this with co-workers. And for supervisors, you may want to seek your own mentoring or discussions in other supervisory forums. We do run some meta supervision sessions here at Surrey. I guess the other thing is just to be mindful of being genuine and transparent without centering the supervisor's discomfort. The other thing acknowledged in the guidance is that the white supervisor will get it wrong at some point, but in terms of that contracting that I mentioned before, planning ahead for kind of repair, how this can be done with responsibility, curiosity, and self-directed learning, and there's some resources there on that live link. An invitation to use supportively challenging feedback in supervision. How can both the supervisor and supervisee give feedback in a way that's heard by the listener? And watching out for shame. These discussions can often lead in that direction. How can we manage the avoidance and withdrawal that goes along with it? Supervisors can work really well alongside mentors. It's good that there's boundaries and separation, but I encourage all my supervisees, trainees in particular, to track mentors from different communities or different professions. The other point that comes up in the guidance is around cultural competence and recognising the huge diversity in racialised communities, and that we need to judge each trainee in terms of their experiences and needs. So in terms of some general pointers for anti-oppressive practice, the first one is name. Name it, because the avoidance of racism in itself is harmful. The next one is acknowledge. Really important to validate and honour a trainee's experience. I think that goes without saying. The next is the invitation. Be explicit that racism is on the agenda for supervision as part of us all learning about it. Next is dilemmas. Share the dilemma. Acknowledge your own discomfort, but don't centre this. How can we repair it when things get wrong? Next, formulation. Like any adverse experiences, we'll be exploring them in terms of formulating them and relating them to a therapeutic relationship or a supervisory relationship. And the end point is about racism, and accept that many colleagues are likely to have experienced racism in our systems and services. So further distinction in terms of developing good practice comes from the work about calling in and calling out. So there's two sides of this. First of all, to be aware of calling out. This is when we need to let someone know that their words or actions are unacceptable. Calling out also involves when we need to interrupt in order to prevent further harm. How do we support each other with something uncomfortable but necessary? So this theme is about how we can take responsibility for our collective ethics and keeping them in place. But it stands in contrast to calling in. Calling in, that's an opportunity to explore deeper and make meaning together. The other parts of calling in, when we are seeking to understand or learn more, how can we ensure our similarities don't obscure shared privileges? Parts of calling in, when we want to imagine different perspectives, possibilities and outcome. So there's a reflection on what's happening rather than a reaction, with the idea being how might we call out the behaviour but call in the person. So that was a brief summary of some of the practice literature. There is some resources there, and further ones are available on the Padlet.